Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back in time, way back, to a morning in 1800s America, and you are a child standing barefoot on a cold wooden floor before the sun has even thought about rising. The fire in the hearth has burned down to orange coals overnight, and it is your job, or your older sibling's job, or really anyone's job who gets nudged awake first, to get it going again. The room smells like wood smoke and something faintly sour, maybe yesterday's dishes, maybe the cured pork hanging from a rafter, maybe just the general atmosphere of a household where 9 people share 4 rooms and bathing is a Saturday event at best. You are hungry. You have been hungry since roughly an hour after last night's supper, and breakfast is still a solid hour away because first the fire needs wood, then the water needs hauling, then the cornmeal needs boiling, and nobody, in this household eats before the work begins. Welcome to the most relatable and simultaneously most exhausting morning routine in American history. And just so we set expectations correctly right from the start, if you were transported to an average 1800s American childhood for even 1 week, you would not survive it. Not because of violence or disease, though those are absolutely on the table, but because you would simply refuse to eat what was put in front of you on day 3, and then you would starve by choice. That is how committed your modern palate is to things like seasoning and variety in food that was not boiled until it surrendered all texture and dignity. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from and what your local time is right now. I genuinely love knowing that someone in rural Australia is doing this at 2 a.m. while someone in a London flat has it playing at a perfectly reasonable 10 p.m. You are all welcome here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The 1800s in America span a full, chaotic century, from a brand new republic still figuring out what it was, all the way through industrialization, westward expansion, civil war, and the first trembling steps toward a modern food system. And through all of it, children ate. They ate whatever their geography, their class, their race, and their season allowed. There was no childhood nutrition science. There was no concept of a balanced meal for a growing body in the way we understand it today. There was simply, what do we have, how do we cook it, and is there enough of it to go around? Usually the answer to that last question was, barely. You have to understand the physical reality of morning in this era before you can understand the food. Most American families in the early 1800s, whether they were farming in Virginia, scratching out a homestead in Ohio, or crowded into a northeastern town, woke before sunrise because daylight was the only reliable free resource they had. Candles cost money. Oil for lamps cost money. Sunlight was free, so you used every last minute of it. This meant that by the time you, as a child, were actually sitting down to eat something, you had already been awake for an hour or more, possibly doing chores in the dark or near dark, possibly helping a parent haul water from a well or a nearby stream, possibly just sitting very still near the fire trying to absorb warmth into your body like a small, tired lizard. Breakfast in the modern sense, this relaxed affair where you choose between several options and pour yourself something cold from a refrigerator, did not exist. There was no choosing. There was what was made, and you ate it, and you were grateful, and if you expressed anything other than gratitude you were met with a look from a parent that could curdle fresh milk. Historians still argue whether the concept of breakfast as a separate, distinct meal was even fully established in American rural culture in the early decades of the 1800s, or whether it was simply the first interruption in the workday where food was consumed. What is agreed upon is this: the morning meal was almost always hot, almost always simple, and almost always the same thing it had been yesterday and would be tomorrow. Variety was a luxury. Consistency was survival. If your family had a good supply of cornmeal, and across most of America, they did, because corn was the great democratic crop of the new nation, then your morning began with something made from it. We will get deep into the cornmeal story in just a moment, because it deserves its own full exploration, but for now just know that it was everywhere, all the time, in a way that would make your modern grocery store brain slightly dizzy. The quirky little detail that most people do not know about 1800s morning food culture is that in many households, especially in the rural South and Midwest, children were not always given the same food as adults at breakfast. Not because anyone was being cruel, necessarily, but because the hierarchy of the household was caloric. The person doing the hardest physical labor got the most fuel. A working father or farmhand needed dense, heavy food. A small child needed something too, yes, but the assumption was that their needs were simpler, their bodies smaller, their workload lighter. So children often ate a thinner, more watered-down version of whatever was on the fire, a looser porridge, a smaller portion, the heel of yesterday's bread softened in warm water or milk if you were lucky. It is a strange thing to imagine, that ordinary morning, standing in that cold room, waiting for the fire to do its slow work on a pot of mush, your breath visible in the air, your stomach making its feelings very clearly known. And yet millions of American children lived exactly that morning, every morning, for the entirety of a century. Let's follow them through the day. Cornmeal. If there is one single ingredient that defines what American children ate in the 1800s more than anything else, more than bread, more than salt pork, more than anything you might romanticize from a Laura Ingalls Wilder novel, it is cornmeal. Ground dried corn, yellow or white depending on your region and your preference, and honestly just whatever the mill was producing that season. It was cheap, it was filling, it stored reasonably well, it could be cooked a dozen different ways, and it grew practically everywhere in America with a stubbornness that farmers genuinely respected. Corn did not care about your feelings. Corn did not need you to coddle it. Corn just grew, and then you ate it, and then you grew it again, and this cycle was the quiet drumbeat underneath the entire food story of 19th-century American childhood. You are sitting now near the fire, and the pot on the crane over the hearth is doing its slow, thick, bubbling thing. The smell is faintly sweet, faintly earthy, deeply familiar to you because you have smelled it every single morning of your remembered life. What is in that pot is most likely cornmeal mush, which is exactly what it sounds like. Cornmeal, water, salt if you had it, cooked low and slow until it became a thick, dense porridge somewhere between the texture of polenta and wet cement. It was not pretty. It was not exciting. But it was hot, and it was filling in that deep, starchy way that kept a child's legs moving through a morning of chores without collapsing. The way you ate it depended on what your family had on hand. If you were fortunate, there was a splash of milk to thin it slightly and add some richness. If you were in a household with access to molasses, and we will talk about that liquid gold later in tonight's journey, you might get a dark drizzle over the top that made the whole bowl suddenly feel like something closer to a treat. If you were in a leaner household, or in a hungry season, you ate it plain, with nothing, and you were grateful for the warmth of the bowl in your hands more than the taste of what was inside it. Cornmeal mush had a second life that children across America were very familiar with, and it is one of those small domestic details that modern people find either charming or quietly depressing depending on their mood. Leftover mush, whatever was not eaten at breakfast, was poured into a pan, allowed to cool and solidify overnight, and then sliced into thick slabs the next morning and fried in whatever fat was available. Bacon grease, lard, butter if you were lucky. These fried mush slices were called by different names in different regions. Some families just called it fried mush, some called it cornmeal pudding, and in parts of the mid-Atlantic it evolved into what we now know as scrapple, though that version had other ingredients added in ways that we do not need to examine too closely before bed. The point is, nothing was wasted. The mush you did not finish became tomorrow's fried breakfast, and the cycle continued with an efficiency that would make a modern meal prep influencer weep with admiration. Johnny cakes are the other cornmeal preparation that deserves your attention tonight. These were flat, dense cornmeal cakes cooked on a griddle or directly on a hearthstone, no yeast, no rising, no waiting. Just cornmeal, water or milk, a bit of salt, shaped into rounds and cooked until they had a slightly crisp exterior and a soft, heavy interior. The name itself is a subject of mild historical amusement. Historians still argue whether Johnny cake is a corruption of journey cake, because they traveled well and could be packed for long trips, or whether it comes from an entirely different regional etymology that varies depending on which scholar you ask and how passionately they feel about colonial linguistics. Either way, children ate them constantly. They were quick to make, required no special equipment, and could be eaten plain or with whatever topping was available, a smear of butter, a dip in syrup, or just held in the hand while walking because you had places to be in a household that did not pause for leisurely seated breakfasts. Hominy was the third great cornmeal product of the 1800s child's morning, particularly in the South. Hominy is corn that has been treated with an alkaline solution, traditionally wood ash lye or slaked lime, in a process called nixtamalization, which is a word that sounds like something from a fantasy novel but is actually one of the most important food technologies in human history. This process unlocks nutrients in the corn that are otherwise inaccessible to the human body, particularly niacin, and the fact that populations eating nixtamalized corn were significantly healthier than those eating plain ground corn is one of those quiet, underappreciated triumphs of indigenous food knowledge. The children eating hominy grits in a southern farmhouse every morning were receiving nutritional benefits that nobody around them could have scientifically explained, but that their bodies understood completely. The quirky historical footnote here, and this is the kind of thing that tends to surface in food history research and then stick in your brain forever, is that when cornmeal spread to parts of Europe as a cheap staple crop in the 18th and early 19th centuries, the populations eating it were not using nixtamalization because that was indigenous American knowledge that did not fully transfer with the grain. The result was widespread pellagra, a niacin deficiency disease, in parts of Italy, Spain, and Romania. American children eating properly prepared hominy were, without knowing it, nutritionally better off than their European counterparts eating the same base ingredient prepared incorrectly. Food knowledge is everything, and the loss of it is always costly. You finish your bowl of mush. You set it down on the rough wooden table. The fire is warm on your face now, the house slowly coming to life around you, and the day, long, physical, hungry-edged, is just beginning. The table itself tells you everything you need to know about power in an 1800s American household, and you, as a child, are reading that table correctly every single morning and evening of your life without anyone having to explain the rules to you. You simply know them, the way you know to stay out of the way when a parent is in a particular mood, the way you know which floorboard creaks and should be avoided at night. The hierarchy of the family meal is not written down anywhere. It does not need to be. It is performed, silently and consistently, at every sitting, until it becomes as natural and unremarkable as breathing. In most American households of the 1800s, rural farm families, which is what most American families were, especially in the first half of the century, the working adults ate first. This was not considered cruel or unusual. It was considered logical. The father, the older sons if they were doing full adult farm labor, any hired hands or farmhands who lived on the property, these people sat down first, filled their plates first, and ate without waiting. Their caloric needs were understood to be the priority because they were doing the work that kept everyone alive. A man swinging an axe from sunup to sundown needed fuel in a way that was visible, immediate, and non-negotiable. The food went to the labor, and the labor kept the family fed, and this circular logic made complete sense to everyone living inside it. You, as a child, waited. Depending on the household, this meant standing near the table watching the adults eat, or sitting at a separate smaller table, or simply hovering somewhere in the vicinity of the kitchen until the signal, spoken or unspoken, indicated that the first round was finished and the remaining food was now available. What remained varied enormously. On a good day, on a prosperous farm in a good season, there was plenty for everyone and the waiting was just a formality, a ritual acknowledgement of hierarchy rather than an actual deprivation. On a harder day, in a leaner season, what was left after the adults finished was genuinely less, smaller portions, the less desirable cuts, the bottom of the pot where the mush had gone slightly thick and crusty, the heel of the bread rather than the soft center. Historians still argue whether this feeding hierarchy was uniformly practiced across all regions and classes, or whether it varied significantly based on household culture, ethnicity, and religious tradition. There is evidence that in some communities, particularly among certain immigrant groups in the Northeast and in Quaker households, children were seated alongside adults from a young age and given equal portions as a matter of both practicality and principle. But in the dominant agricultural culture of the early to mid-1800s, the working adult's nutritional priority was the default, and children understood their place in that order with a matter-of-factness that we might find uncomfortable today but that made complete, survival-oriented sense in its context. The physical layout of meals mattered too. In the early part of the century, the idea of individual plates for each family member was less universal than you might assume. Many households ate from communal bowls or a central pot, each person using a spoon, wooden, usually, because pewter and metal were expensive, to take their portion. Children shared. They ate quickly, because the bowl was communal and hesitation meant less food. There was no leisurely picking at your meal, no negotiating with a parent about vegetables, no dramatic announcements that you did not like what was being served. You ate what was in the bowl, at the pace the bowl demanded, and you did not editorialize. The concept of children having different food preferences that adults were obligated to accommodate was, to put it gently, not a feature of 1800s American family culture. Food preference was a luxury of abundance, and abundance was not the default condition. If the pot had salt pork and turnips in it, that was what dinner was, and every person at that table, adult, child, elderly grandparent, was eating salt pork and turnips. The idea of making a separate, child-friendly version of a meal would have struck most 1800s parents as not merely impractical but faintly absurd, a confusion of priorities that only someone with too much time and too much food could possibly entertain. And yet, there was tenderness in it too. This is the thing that food historians sometimes struggle to communicate without sliding into either sentimentality or unnecessary harshness. Parents in the 1800s loved their children with the same ferocity that parents always have, and many of the small food rituals of the era were expressions of that love within the constraints of what was possible. A mother saving the crispiest corner of the Johnny cake for the youngest child. A father bringing home a small paper twist of penny candy from town and making it last a week by rationing it out in tiny pieces after supper. A grandmother keeping a small jar of apple butter hidden on a particular shelf and spreading it on bread for grandchildren when no one particularly important was watching. The scraps and the seconds and the bottom of the pot portions that children received were also not always the least desirable parts of the meal by every measure. In households where meat was scarce, children often received the broth rather than the meat, but broth, slow-cooked from bones for hours, was nutritionally rich in ways that nobody in the 1800s had the science to articulate but that bodies recognized. The bones themselves, cracked and the marrow sucked out, were given to children as something between a snack and a treat, and the rich fatty marrow inside was calorie-dense and deeply nourishing even if it sounds like something from a very different kind of meal than you are imagining right now. You take your place at the edge of the table, or at the small side table, or standing near the fire with your bowl, and you eat quickly and quietly, and you are fed, and that is enough. For tonight, it is enough. You are moving west now. Not by choice, necessarily, nobody asked your opinion. You are 8 years old and your father has decided that the land in Ohio or Indiana or Missouri is cheaper and more plentiful than whatever scraped-out plot the family was working back east, and so the wagon is packed and the family is moving and you are going with it, obviously, because where else would you go? The journey itself is a food story that we will not linger on too long tonight, but you should know that what you ate on the trail, dried corn, hardtack, whatever could be hunted along the way, was a preview of what your diet was going to look like for the next several years while your family carved a homestead out of land that was not yet farmable and would not be fully productive for at least a season or two. The frontier was not a place that eased you into its dietary realities gently. It introduced them all at once, with the bluntness of a winter that arrived before your cabin walls were finished. Frontier children in the 1800s ate meat in quantities and varieties that would genuinely surprise you, not because frontier life was luxurious but because wild game was often the most accessible protein source available when you were living on land that had not yet been cleared and planted. The eastern seaboard had been farming for generations by the time the frontier push was in full motion, but out on the edge of settled land, the forest and the prairie were still full. Deer were abundant. Wild turkey moved through the woods in flocks large enough that a reasonably competent hunter could bring back enough meat to feed a family for several days in a single morning. Squirrel, rabbit, and raccoon were caught so regularly that children grew up eating them without any sense that these were unusual foods. They were just meat, the way chicken is just meat to you now, unremarkable in its familiarity. You, as a frontier child, almost certainly knew how to do things with a hunted animal that would make a modern adult's eyes go wide. By the age of 7 or 8, many children on the frontier were expected to assist with the dressing and butchering of small game. Not the full process, necessarily, but enough to be useful, holding, fetching, learning by proximity the way that most practical knowledge was transmitted in this era. There were no instruction manuals for frontier childhood. You watched, you helped, you learned, and eventually you did it yourself, and the knowledge lived in your hands rather than in any book. Salt pork was the great backup protein of frontier life, and it deserves a moment of genuine respect even if it sounds deeply unromantic. Pork was the frontier meat of choice for preservation because pigs were practical animals. They could forage for much of their own food, they reproduced quickly, they converted almost anything edible into body mass with impressive efficiency, and once slaughtered, nearly every part of the animal could be used. The salt curing process meant that pork could be preserved for months without refrigeration, which was not a technology that existed and would not exist for most of the century. A barrel of salt pork in the root cellar was insurance. It was the difference between a hungry winter and a surviving one, and children understood this in the bone-deep way that you understand things when your physical comfort depends on them. The specific experience of eating salt pork as a child is worth lingering on for a moment because it was so constant, so present, so absolutely woven into the fabric of daily frontier eating that to skip over it would be like telling the story of modern childhood eating without mentioning breakfast cereal. Salt pork was fatty, intensely salty, obviously, and chewy in a way that required real effort from a child's jaw. It was almost never eaten alone. It went into the pot with beans, with greens, with whatever vegetables were available, and its fat and salt seasoned everything around it. The beans absorbed its smokiness. The greens wilted and softened in its rendered fat. The broth that resulted from a long-cooked pot of salt pork and dried beans was thick and savory and smelled like the interior of every frontier cabin you ever entered, a smell so embedded in the childhood memory of the era that elderly Americans in the late 1800s reportedly associated it with comfort and home in the way that people now associate the smell of cookies baking or coffee brewing. Historians still argue whether the heavy meat consumption on the American frontier represented a genuine nutritional advantage over the more grain-heavy diets of the eastern seaboard and Europe, or whether the lack of vegetable variety created deficiencies that balanced out any protein benefit. The evidence suggests it was complicated, as evidence always suggests when the question is complicated. Frontier children were often robust and physically capable, but they also suffered from scurvy in late winter when preserved foods had run out and no fresh vegetables were available, a condition that manifested in bleeding gums and fatigue, and that their parents treated with pine needle tea or whatever wild greens could be found emerging from the spring soil, often before the ground was fully thawed. The quirky footnote to frontier meat eating that tends to surprise people is bear. Bear meat was eaten regularly by frontier families, and children ate it without ceremony or special occasion. Bear fat in particular was considered a valuable cooking resource, rendered down and used in place of lard for frying and baking, and bear grease had additional household uses as a lubricant and a skin protectant against the cold and wind. A child rubbed with bear grease before a cold morning of outdoor work was simultaneously moisturized and slightly terrifying to approach, but practicality was the governing principle of frontier life and bear grease worked, so bear grease it was. The sun is lower now over the treeline, and somewhere in the distance there is the sound of a rifle, and you already know what that means for tonight's supper. Behind the cabin, or behind the farmhouse, or tucked alongside whatever structure your family calls home in this particular decade and this particular geography, there is a patch of ground that your mother tends with the same focused intensity that your father gives to the main fields. It is smaller, messier, more personal somehow, a kitchen garden, a dooryard garden, a truck patch, called different things in different regions but serving the same essential function everywhere. This is where the vegetables come from. Not from a store, not from a market in any regular or reliable sense, but from this specific rectangle of turned earth that your family has planted, weeded, watered through dry spells, protected from rabbits and deer and the chickens that always seem to find their way in despite every effort, and harvested with the kind of attention that you give to things your survival genuinely depends on. Because it does. The kitchen garden is not a hobby. It is infrastructure. You have spent time in this garden. More time than you wanted to, almost certainly, because weeding is one of those tasks that falls naturally to children in an era before anyone had conceptualized child labor laws or the radical notion that a summer afternoon might be spent doing something purely for enjoyment. You know this garden by its smell in different seasons, the green sharpness of bean plants in early summer, the heavy sweetness of tomato vines in August, the cold root vegetable earthiness of October when you are pulling the last turnips and parsnips before the ground freezes. You know it by the feel of the soil in different weather, dry and crumbling in a drought, dark and sticky after rain. You know which plants your family grows every year without fail because they are reliable and productive, and you know which ones your mother tries occasionally and then abandons because they did not do well in your particular soil or your particular climate or simply because nobody in the family would eat them. The vegetables that defined American children's diets in the 1800s are not the vegetables that define childhood eating today, and this gap is worth sitting with for a moment. Turnips were everywhere. Not as a side dish, not as an occasional variation, but as a staple, a root vegetable that stored well through winter, grew in poor soil without complaint, and could be boiled, mashed, roasted, or added to soups and stews to add bulk and mild sweetness. Children ate turnips the way modern children eat potatoes, which is to say constantly and without particular enthusiasm but also without much active resistance because turnips were simply part of the texture of eating and resistance required an energy that hunger did not leave much room for. Parsnips occupied a similar role, another root vegetable, slightly sweeter than a turnip when cooked, equally good at surviving winter storage in a root cellar packed with sand. Dried beans in astonishing variety were grown in virtually every kitchen garden in America, because beans were one of the most efficient crops a family could raise, high in protein, easy to dry and store, capable of being stretched into soups and stews that fed many people from a small quantity of the actual bean. Children grew up eating beans in some form almost daily, and the specific varieties of beans a family favored often had regional or ethnic flavor. Certain German immigrant communities grew specific heirloom varieties they had brought as seeds from Europe, tucked into luggage or clothing like small botanical treasures. Potatoes arrive in this story as something of a latecomer to mainstream American kitchen gardens, gaining significant ground in the early to mid-1800s partly due to the influence of Irish immigrant communities and partly because potatoes were simply extraordinarily productive, more calories per acre than almost any other crop a small family garden could produce. Once potatoes were established in a family's garden rotation, they became central with a speed that reflected just how practical and filling they were. A boiled potato with a scrape of butter or dripping was a meal in itself for a child, dense and starchy and warming in cold weather in a way that felt almost medicinal. The seasonal reality of the kitchen garden meant that children's vegetable eating followed a rhythm that was completely different from the year-round availability of everything that you are accustomed to. In late spring and early summer, there were fresh greens, dandelion leaves, watercress from nearby streams, the first tender lettuce, young pea shoots, and children ate these with something approaching eagerness after a winter of preserved foods. In high summer came beans, corn on the cob, cucumbers, squash, and the tomato, which had a complicated relationship with the American table. For much of the early 1800s, tomatoes were regarded with suspicion, widely believed in folk culture to be potentially poisonous because they belonged to the nightshade family, their bright red fruit visually similar to toxic berries that genuinely would harm you. Historians still argue about how widespread this tomato suspicion actually was and whether it was an educated class phenomenon or genuinely a rural folk belief, but what is clear is that tomato adoption was uneven and gradual rather than immediate and universal. The quirky detail that tends to delight food historians is that children in many households were actually the first family members to eat tomatoes regularly, not because they were braver or more adventurous than adults but because tomatoes grown in kitchen gardens in summer were accessible, bright, attractive objects at a child's eye level, and children simply ate them the way they ate any fruit they encountered in the garden, without consulting an adult first. The resulting lack of immediate death presumably helped the tomato's reputation considerably. By autumn, the garden was giving its last abundance, winter squash piled in orange and green heaps, the last of the dried beans shelled and stored, the root vegetables lifted and carried to the cellar. And then it was over, and the long-preserved winter began, and the garden became just a rectangle of frozen earth waiting for spring with the same patient stoicism that the whole family was about to need. There is a smell that lives in the memory of almost every American child who grew up in the 1800s, buried somewhere beneath the wood smoke and the animal smells and the particular earthiness of a household that did not have running water, and that smell is bread. Not the soft, pillowy, pre-sliced bread that appears in your kitchen without any effort on your part, sealed in a plastic bag with a little colored twist tie and a shelf life measured in weeks. This bread is different. It is denser, darker, more irregular in shape, with a crust that has genuine structural integrity and a crumb that is tight and chewy and faintly sour if your family uses a sourdough starter, or yeasty and warm if your mother keeps a crock of brewing yeast on the shelf above the fireplace. It has been mixed and kneaded by hand, left to rise in a warm corner of the kitchen, shaped by hands that have done the same motion so many times that they no longer need to think about it, and baked in a Dutch oven buried in hearth coals or in a beehive oven built into the side of the fireplace if your family is prosperous enough to have one. Bread was not a side item in the 1800s American diet. It was not a vehicle for sandwich fillings or a complement to soup. It was, for many families and many children, the central fact of the meal, the thing that everything else orbited around. You ate bread at breakfast, at dinner, at supper. You ate it plain when nothing else was available. You ate it sopped in pot liquor, the savory liquid left in the pot after greens or beans had been cooked, and that combination of rough bread and pot liquor was a meal complete enough to send a child through an afternoon of work without complaint. You ate it as a plate, sometimes literally, using a thick slice as a trencher to hold other foods the way medieval Europeans had done and the way frontier Americans continued to do because practicality does not concern itself with the passage of centuries. The making of bread was one of the central domestic skills of the era, and the knowledge of it was transmitted from mother to daughter, and sometimes to sons, though the gendering of kitchen labor in the 1800s was rigid enough that a boy learning to bake bread was the exception rather than the rule, with the seriousness of an apprenticeship. You did not simply follow a recipe, because recipes as we understand them were not universally available or even universally useful in an era when oven temperatures could not be measured and flour varied in protein content and moisture level from batch to batch and season to season. You learned to feel the dough, to read it with your hands, to know by its texture and elasticity whether it needed more flour or more water, whether it had proofed long enough, whether the oven was hot enough by holding your hand inside it and counting how many seconds you could tolerate the heat. The sourdough starter deserves particular attention tonight because it was a remarkable domestic object, a living thing, essentially, a culture of wild yeast and bacteria that a family maintained indefinitely, feeding it flour and water, keeping it warm, carrying it with them when they moved the way you might carry a pet. Some frontier families reportedly carried their starters in pouches worn close to the body during winter travel to keep the culture alive in freezing temperatures. Historians still argue about how continuous the lineage of any particular starter actually was, whether the stories of starters passed down through generations for 50 or 100 years are literally accurate or whether they are a form of domestic mythology that served important functions of family identity and continuity. What is not in dispute is that the starter represented skill, continuity, and a kind of domestic wealth that was real even if it did not appear on any balance sheet. Children were involved in bread making in specific, age-appropriate ways from quite young ages. The youngest children might be given a small piece of dough to knead and shape themselves, producing small misshapen rolls that were baked alongside the main loaves, a pedagogical technique as much as a practical one, teaching the feel of dough and the process of transformation from raw ingredient to baked good through direct physical experience. Older children took on real responsibilities, mixing, kneading for the sustained period that proper bread development required, monitoring the rise, managing the fire temperature during baking. By the time a girl in the 1800s was 12 or 13, she was expected to be capable of producing the family's bread independently, and this capability was considered a fundamental life skill rather than an optional domestic accomplishment. Biscuits occupy a separate and beloved corner of the 1800s bread story, particularly in the South and in households that had access to soft wheat flour and lard or butter for the fat. Biscuits were quick, no yeast, no rising time, just flour and fat and liquid worked together quickly and baked in a hot oven, producing something flaky and tender and entirely different in character from the dense yeast bread that required hours of attention. The technique for good biscuits was famously difficult to teach because it depended on a lightness of hand that resisted description, working the fat into the flour just enough but not too much, handling the dough minimally to preserve the flakiness that came from keeping the fat in distinct pieces rather than incorporating it smoothly. Some women in the 1800s were known regionally for their biscuits the way that artists are known for their work, their skill referenced in community memory and admired at church socials and harvest suppers. The quirky historical footnote here is that beaten biscuits, a specific southern variety made by literally beating the dough with a mallet or rolling pin for 30 minutes or more, were considered a mark of a well-run household partly because the labor required to make them demonstrated that the household had either time or enslaved labor to spare. The biscuit was not just food. It was a social signal baked in flour and fat. You tear your piece of bread in half and press it into the bottom of your bowl, soaking up what remains, and it is the best part of the whole meal. You are standing in a general store somewhere in the middle of the century, and your father is doing the slow, careful arithmetic of a man who does not have money to waste. He is looking at the shelf where the sugar is kept, white refined sugar in a cone shape, wrapped in blue paper, sitting there like a small monument to everything that costs more than it should. You are looking at it too, from a lower angle, with the specific focused attention of a child who understands, without anyone having told you explicitly, that what happens in the next 30 seconds will determine whether the next several weeks contain any sweetness at all or whether they continue in the direction they have been going, which is the direction of plain mush and salt pork and bread without anything on it. Your father picks up the sugar cone, weighs it in his hand with the expression of a man doing silent calculations, and sets it back down. He picks up the smaller, cheaper tin of molasses instead. You have been here before. You knew how this was going to go. You are not even disappointed. Exactly, disappointment requires a level of surprise that you have long since used up. Sweetness in the 1800s American child's diet was rare in a way that is genuinely difficult for a modern person to absorb, not intellectually, you can understand it intellectually, but viscerally, in the body, in the place where your sugar cravings live. You have grown up in a world so thoroughly saturated with sweetness that it arrives in your food without your even noticing it, in bread, in condiments, in things that are not supposed to be sweet but are anyway because food manufacturers discovered that sugar makes everything more appealing and more addictive and therefore more purchased. The average American today consumes somewhere in the neighborhood of 17 teaspoons of added sugar per day. The average American child in the early 1800s consumed a fraction of that, and the fraction was not a generous one. White refined sugar was expensive throughout much of the century, imported and processed through a supply chain that was both economically and morally complicated. The sugar economy of the 19th century was deeply entangled with the slave trade in the Caribbean, a fact that some abolition-minded households in the northern states were actively aware of and that drove a specific movement encouraging families to boycott slave-produced sugar in favor of alternatives. Historians still argue about how widespread this free produce movement actually was and whether it had any meaningful economic impact, or whether it was primarily a gesture of moral positioning by middle-class northern reformers that left the actual sugar economy largely unchanged. What is clear is that for most American families, the price of white sugar rather than its moral provenance was the governing factor in how much of it they bought, and the answer was, not much. Molasses was the democratic sweetener of 19th-century America, and it deserves a moment of real appreciation even if it is not the glamorous ingredient in this story. Molasses is what remains after sugar cane juice has been boiled down and the crystallized sugar extracted, a thick, dark, intensely flavored syrup that carries the mineral richness and slight bitterness of everything that refined sugar has had removed from it. It was significantly cheaper than white sugar, widely available, and used in cooking and baking and as a direct table sweetener throughout the century. Blackstrap molasses, the darkest, most strongly flavored product of the third boiling, was the cheapest of all, and it was what many poorer families used, its flavor strong enough to dominate whatever it was added to, but its caloric and mineral content genuinely substantial. Children drizzled it on their johnnycakes, stirred it into their mush, spread it on bread with a knife the way you might use jam, and drank it dissolved in warm water as a beverage that was sweet and warming and cost almost nothing. Maple syrup and maple sugar occupied a special place in the sweetness landscape of the northern states, particularly in New England and the upper Midwest, where sugar maple trees grew in abundance, and the spring sugaring season was one of the genuine pleasures of the agricultural calendar. Sugaring, tapping the trees, collecting the sap in wooden buckets, boiling it down over outdoor fires in enormous iron kettles, was a community event as much as a food production activity, and children participated in it with an enthusiasm that was notable precisely because most farm work did not inspire enthusiasm. The boiling sap smelled extraordinary. The foam that formed on top of the boiling kettle was skimmed off and given to children to eat warm, a treat so anticipated that children reportedly began asking about sugaring season before the winter was even half over. Maple sugar, boiled down further than syrup to a solid form, was poured into molds and hardened into small cakes or shapes that were given to children as candy, possibly the closest thing to actual candy that most rural children encountered on a regular basis. Honey was the other natural sweetener available to families who kept bees or who lived near areas where wild bee colonies could be found, and raided with a combination of courage and smoke and protective clothing that was considerably less sophisticated than modern beekeeping equipment. Wild honey hunting was genuinely dangerous, and the children who accompanied adults on honey-finding expeditions understood this, which made the sweetness at the end of it taste like something that had been earned rather than simply consumed. The quirky detail here is that in some communities, beeswax, the byproduct of honey extraction, was chewed by children as a kind of primitive gum, not sweet in itself but carrying residual honey flavor and providing that oral satisfaction of something to chew that apparently transcends centuries and cultural contexts. Brown sugar, when a family could afford it, was considered a reasonable middle ground between the luxury of white sugar and the intense earthiness of blackstrap molasses, sweet enough to feel like a treat, affordable enough to appear occasionally without financial crisis. A spoonful of brown sugar dissolved in warm milk at bedtime, in a household that could manage such a thing, was considered a comfort and a kindness, the 1800s equivalent of a warm drink before sleep. You watch your father carry the tin of molasses to the counter, and you decide that molasses is fine. Molasses is actually pretty good. Molasses will do. The cow is already awake when you get to the barn. She is always already awake, which is one of those small bovine facts that you have absorbed so completely into your understanding of morning that it no longer registers as remarkable. The cow waits for no one, the cow has opinions about the timing of her milking, and the cow will make those opinions known through a combination of restless shifting and increasingly pointed lowing if you are late by even a few minutes. You are not late this morning. You have learned, through the particular education that only genuine consequences can provide, that being late to the milking is an experience you prefer not to repeat. So here you are, in the gray pre-dawn, your breath making small clouds in the cold air of the barn, settling onto the three-legged stool with the bucket positioned correctly, beginning the rhythmic pull and squeeze that will occupy your hands for the next 20 minutes while your mind goes wherever it wants to go, which this morning is somewhere warm and horizontal and not a barn. Dairy was woven into the daily life of American farm children in the 1800s with an intimacy that goes well beyond simply drinking milk. You did not just consume dairy products, you produced them, tended them, managed them, understood their rhythms and their requirements the way you understood the rhythms and requirements of every other living thing in your household's care. The cow was a financial and nutritional asset of enormous importance, and children who were trusted with her milking were being given real responsibility, not a token chore designed to build character but actual essential labor that the household depended on. If you milked poorly, if you did not fully empty the udder, if you allowed contamination of the bucket, if you startled the cow into kicking, there were real consequences measured in less milk, in a cow that dried up earlier than she should have, in a family that had less butter and less cheese going into winter. Raw milk was what you drank, because pasteurization was not developed until the 1860s by Louis Pasteur and did not become widespread practice in American dairies until the very end of the century and into the early 1900s. This is one of those historical facts that lands differently depending on your relationship with food safety information. Raw milk contains all the beneficial enzymes and bacteria that pasteurization eliminates, which has its genuine advocates even today, but it also carries the genuine risk of harboring pathogens, tuberculosis bacteria, brucellosis, typhoid, that pasteurization neutralizes. Children in the 1800s drank raw milk their entire childhoods, and many of them were fine, and some of them were not, and the ones who were not often died of illnesses whose connection to the milk supply was not understood because germ theory was not yet established as medical consensus until the latter half of the century. Historians still argue about the net nutritional impact of raw dairy consumption in the 1800s versus the disease risk it carried, and the answer is genuinely complex. What is not in dispute is that for children who had reliable access to dairy, and not all children did, as we will see in other sections of tonight's journey, the nutritional contribution was significant. Milk provided protein, fat, calcium, and vitamins in a diet that was otherwise heavily weighted toward carbohydrates from grains and calories from preserved meats. A child who drank a cup or two of whole milk daily was getting nutritional support that a child in a dairy-poor household was not, and this difference showed up in growth and health outcomes in ways that contemporary observers noticed even without the scientific framework to fully explain what they were seeing. Butter making was one of the central domestic labors of the dairy farm, and children participated in it from young ages with varying degrees of willingness. The process was straightforward in theory and tedious in practice. Cream skimmed from the top of milk that had been allowed to sit and separate was poured into a churn, and then you moved the dasher up and down, in a motion that was simple enough to be performed without much thought and repetitive enough to be genuinely exhausting over the 30 to 60 minutes it typically took for the cream to break and the butter to form. Children were assigned churning duty with the same resigned practicality with which they were assigned weeding and wood carrying. It needed to be done, small bodies could do it, and therefore small bodies did it. The moment when the churning finally changed, when the resistance in the dasher shifted and the sloshing sound of liquid cream became the heavier, clumpier sound of butter forming, was one of those small domestic satisfactions that children of the era apparently remembered well into adulthood. There is something genuinely pleasing about a transformation you caused with your own physical effort, and butter making had this quality of visible, tangible result that many farm chores lacked. The fresh butter, rinsed in cold water and worked with wooden paddles to remove the remaining buttermilk, was then salted for preservation and packed into crocks or shaped into rounds with decorative stamps. The butter mold, carved with a simple design of a wheat sheaf or a flower, was a household object of both function and modest aesthetic pride. Buttermilk, the liquid left after the butter formed, was drunk by children as a beverage that was tangy, slightly thick, and deeply unfashionable by modern standards but nutritionally useful and freely available as a byproduct of the churning process. Many children of the era apparently developed genuine affection for it, its sourness a kind of acquired taste that became associated with the specific comfort of the dairy and the cool dimness of the springhouse where milk and butter were kept cold. The quirky detail that tends to surface in dairy history is that orange-colored butter, which people now associate with quality and richness, was often the result of deliberate coloring with carrot juice or annatto seed in winter, when the cow's diet of hay rather than fresh grass produced pale, yellowish-white butter that consumers found less appealing. The color was cosmetic. The taste was identical. But appearances mattered even in 1800s butter commerce, and farmers' wives who sold butter at market learned this quickly. You finish the milking, carry the bucket carefully to the house, and your mother already has the separator ready, and the morning continues its reliable, dairy-scented way. Somewhere in the basement of the house, or dug into the hillside behind the cabin, or built into the cool north-facing corner of the root cellar, there is a darkness that smells like time. It smells like earth and salt and something faintly animal and something faintly fermented and something that your nose categorizes as neither pleasant nor unpleasant but simply as winter, as the specific sensory signature of food that has been transformed by human hands into something that will last. You have been down here many times. You know which crock holds the pickled cucumbers and which holds the sauerkraut and which holds the salted beans that your mother packed in layers with handfuls of coarse salt back in August when the bean plants were producing faster than the family could eat them fresh. You know the smell of each barrel and crock the way you know the voices of your family members, individually, specifically, without having to think about it. This cellar is not a scary place, despite what the darkness and the smell might suggest to someone encountering it for the first time. This cellar is survival. This cellar is the reason your family will eat in February. Food preservation was not a skill or a hobby in the 1800s American household. It was a seasonal imperative, a race against time and temperature and microbial reality that every family ran every autumn with the full understanding that the outcome of this race would determine the quality of the next several months of eating. The work of preservation, the salting, the smoking, the pickling, the drying, the fermenting, the potting in fat, the burying in sand, occupied weeks of intense household labor in the fall, and children were embedded in this labor from the time they were old enough to be useful, which in the 1800s was considerably younger than modern sensibilities might assume. Salting was the oldest and most fundamental preservation method, and children understood it practically before they understood it conceptually. You saw salt go into things, beans, cabbage, cucumbers, meat, And you understood that the salt somehow changed what was going to happen to those foods over time, that it was doing something invisible but essential that kept the food from becoming the other thing it might become, the thing that smelled wrong and made people sick. The actual mechanism, that salt draws water out of cells and creates an inhospitable environment for the bacteria that cause spoilage, was not something anyone in your household could have explained in those terms, but the practical knowledge was deep and reliable. Too little salt and the food spoiled. Too much salt and the food became inedibly briny and had to be soaked extensively before cooking. The right amount of salt was something learned through experience and transmitted as practical wisdom rather than measured quantity. Smoking was the preservation method most directly associated with meat, and the smokehouse, a small, often windowless outbuilding where meat was hung over smoldering fires of specific hardwoods, was a structure of real importance on any farm that kept pigs or hunted regularly. The choice of wood mattered. Hickory produced a particular flavor, apple wood a sweeter note, green wood of the wrong variety could impart bitterness or fail to produce the preservative compounds that proper smoking required. Children absorbed this wood knowledge the way they absorbed most practical knowledge of the era, through proximity and participation and the gradual accumulation of direct experience. A child who had helped tend a smokehouse fire for several autumns understood intuitively things about smoke and heat and timing that could not be fully conveyed in words. The hog killing in late autumn was one of the major food events of the agricultural year, an occasion that combined the grimly practical with something that functioned almost like community celebration. Neighbors often came to help, because the work of butchering a large animal and processing every part of it into preserved form was substantial enough to benefit from multiple pairs of hands, and the informal reciprocity of rural communities meant that the family whose hogs were killed today would send help when the neighbor's killing day came. Children were present for all of this. They were not shielded from the reality of where their food came from in the way that modern children are largely insulated from the processes behind the meat that arrives in their homes prepackaged and pre-portioned. A child in the 1800s watched a pig become food, understood the transformation completely, and integrated this knowledge into their relationship with eating in a way that was matter-of-fact rather than traumatic precisely because it was normalized, expected, and surrounded by the purposeful activity of adults treating the whole process with practical respect. Pickling extended the vegetable season through winter with a tanginess that children apparently either loved or tolerated but rarely actively resisted, possibly because the alternative was no vegetables at all and even a pickled cucumber was better than turnips again. The brine, vinegar or salt water, sometimes flavored with dill, mustard seed, or horseradish, transformed cucumbers, green beans, beets, and cabbage into preserved forms that lasted for months and provided a sharpness of flavor that cut through the heaviness of the preserved meat and starchy grain diet of winter. Sauerkraut, fermented cabbage, was particularly common in communities with German immigrant heritage, and its lactofermentation process produced beneficial bacteria that were genuinely good for digestive health, a fact that nobody in the 1800s understood scientifically but that the body experienced as a kind of settling, a rightness in the gut that came from eating living fermented food. Historians still argue about whether the preservation methods of the 1800s, taken as a whole, provided children with adequate nutrition through winter or whether the inevitable loss of certain vitamins and the heavy reliance on salt-preserved foods created seasonal nutritional deficiencies that compounded over the winter months. The evidence points toward a complicated picture where preserved food kept families alive and functional while subtly depleting specific nutrients, vitamin C most notably, in ways that manifested as fatigue and susceptibility to illness in late winter before the first fresh foods of spring arrived. The quirky detail that tends to delight food historians is that dried corn, hominy, parched corn, dried whole kernels, was sometimes packed so densely in barrels and stored so carefully that families opening a barrel in March or April would find the top layer had absorbed moisture and sprouted, producing tiny pale corn seedlings growing in the dark of the storage barrel, which were then eaten as fresh greens because nothing that was edible was ever discarded, and necessity is reliably the mother of both invention and appetite. You close the cellar door behind you and carry your jar of pickled beans up into the light, and the cold smell of preservation follows you briefly before the outdoor air takes it away. You are somewhere different now. The smell is different, the sound is different, the entire texture of the world outside your window is different in a way that takes some adjustment if you have spent your whole life with nothing but farmland and forest as your reference point. You are in a city, New York, perhaps, or Boston, or Philadelphia, or Baltimore, and the city in the 1800s is a sensory experience of considerable intensity even before you add hunger to the equation. The streets are loud with cartwheels and animal hooves and the overlapping voices of people conducting the business of urban life at close quarters. The smells are complex in ways that rural life did not prepare you for: sewage and river water and coal smoke and the particular warm smell of crowds, cut through occasionally by something that makes your stomach respond before your brain catches up, something coming from a cart or a doorway or a woman standing at the corner with a basket, something hot and edible and close enough to touch if you had the penny to pay for it. Urban childhood eating in the 1800s was a fundamentally different experience from its rural counterpart, and the differences were not simply about variety or sophistication. They were structural, reflecting the way that cities reorganized the relationship between food production and food consumption in ways that were genuinely new in human experience. A rural child lived inside the food production process. An urban child, particularly a poor urban child in a rapidly growing industrial city, lived at the end of a supply chain that they had no part in and limited ability to influence. Food came from somewhere else, arrived through systems of commerce and distribution that were often unreliable and frequently corrupt, and cost money that urban working families had in uncertain and often insufficient quantities. The street food economy of 1800s American cities was remarkable in its variety and its accessibility, and children were among its most regular customers, both as buyers when they had pennies to spend and as vendors, because children selling food on city streets was entirely normal and wholly uncontroversial in an era that had not yet developed either child labor laws or the concept of childhood as a protected period of life separate from economic participation. A child of 8 or 10 selling hot corn from a basket or oysters from a cart on a New York street corner in the 1840s or 1850s was a common enough sight that contemporary observers mentioned it as simply part of the urban landscape rather than as something requiring comment or concern. Hot corn was among the most iconic of New York street foods in the mid-1800s, sold primarily by women and girls, often African American women and girls, in a street food economy where racial and gender hierarchies shaped who sold what and where, who carried baskets of roasted corn ears wrapped in husks, calling their wares with specific cries that became part of the sonic identity of the city. A child with a penny could buy an ear of hot corn and eat it standing on the street, and this was a complete transaction, a meal fragment, a moment of warmth and sweetness in a day that might not have much of either. The hot corn girls of New York were documented by journalists and depicted by artists of the era with a combination of sentimentality and genuine social observation, their presence representing both the vitality of the street food economy and the precariousness of urban poverty. Oysters deserve their own moment in this story because they occupied a genuinely extraordinary position in 1800s urban food culture. They were cheap. Absurdly, almost incomprehensibly cheap by modern standards, because the oyster beds of New York Harbor and the surrounding waters were so productive in the early to mid-1800s that oysters were among the most affordable foods available in the city, eaten by poor children and working families as a regular, unremarkable protein source rather than the luxury item they have become today. Oyster carts, oyster cellars, oyster stands, these were everywhere in mid-century New York, and a child who could scrape together a few cents could eat oysters, raw or roasted or made into a simple stew, with a frequency and casualness that would seem extraordinary now. Historians still argue about whether the popular claim that oysters were so cheap they were practically given away represents literal truth or retrospective romanticization, but what is clear is that they were genuinely accessible to people at the bottom of the economic ladder in a way that no comparably nutritious food is today. Tenement cooking, the food prepared in the cramped, poorly ventilated apartments of immigrant working families in cities like New York and Boston, had its own character shaped by the constraints of the space and the ingredients available in urban markets. A tenement kitchen might have a single small stove, shared with other families on the floor, or a coal or wood burning range that served both for cooking and for heat. The dishes prepared on these stoves reflected the ethnic origins of the families cooking them: Italian immigrants making pasta and bean soups, Jewish families from Eastern Europe preparing cholent and kugel, Irish families cooking potatoes in every form their small repertoire allowed, German families making the soups and sausages and pickled vegetables of their home regions. Children in these households ate food that was culturally specific, prepared by mothers and grandmothers who were transplanting culinary knowledge across an ocean and adapting it to American ingredients with varying degrees of success and homesickness. The quirky footnote to urban child eating in the 1800s is the penny candy store, which emerged as a genuine institution in American cities by mid-century, small shops where a penny bought a selection of simple hard candies, licorice, or sugar-based confections, and where children conducted transactions of enormous psychological weight given how rarely they had money of their own. The penny candy store was the first place many urban children experienced something like consumer choice, the ability to stand before an array of options and select according to preference rather than eating whatever was put in front of them. It was a small freedom, measured in sugar and pennies, but freedom nonetheless. You stand on the corner with your hot ear of corn and watch the city move around you, and for this moment, this warm and fleeting moment, you are completely fed. The voice drops here, and the pace slows, because this section of tonight's journey requires something different from us, a kind of stillness, a willingness to look directly at something that American food history has too often looked away from, softened, or buried beneath the more comfortable narratives of frontier resourcefulness and farmhouse abundance. What enslaved children ate in the antebellum South is not a footnote to the larger story of 1800s American childhood eating. It is a central chapter, a defining one, and the fact that it has been understudied and underrepresented in mainstream food history is itself a historical fact worth acknowledging before we begin. You are a child on a plantation. The specific geography varies: coastal South Carolina, the Mississippi Delta, the Virginia Tidewater, the sugar parishes of Louisiana, but the fundamental structure of your daily eating life is determined not by your family's choices, not by the season's abundance or scarcity, not by the accumulated domestic wisdom of a mother who has decided what her children need. It is determined by the enslaver. The food given to enslaved people was a calculated provision, calibrated to maintain the physical capacity for labor at the lowest possible cost, and children within the system received what the system allocated, which was rarely enough and almost never designed with their nutritional development as the primary consideration. The standard ration on most plantations consisted of cornmeal and salt pork, the same two staples that appear throughout tonight's journey, but appearing here in a context that strips them of any homey familiarity. A weekly ration of roughly a peck of cornmeal and 3 to 4 pounds of salt pork was common on many plantations, distributed to adults and expected to feed families including children. The cornmeal was ground coarsely, the salt pork was the lowest quality cuts, fatback, jowl, the parts that even the cheapest commercial market did not value, and the combination, while caloric, was nutritionally incomplete in ways that produced visible effects in the children who depended on it. Protein deficiency, vitamin deficiencies, the particular bloating associated with inadequate nutrition in children, these were documented by observers of the era with a clinical detachment that itself tells you something about the moral framework within which the observation was being made. Enslaved families supplemented these rations through means that required both ingenuity and courage. Many enslaved people maintained small garden plots, sometimes permitted, sometimes tolerated, sometimes hidden, where they grew vegetables that the plantation ration did not include. Collard greens, sweet potatoes, black-eyed peas, and okra were grown in these plots with the specific knowledge of people whose agricultural traditions stretched back through generations of farming in West and Central Africa, where many of these plants had their origins. The sweet potato in particular became a staple of enslaved people's supplementary diet with good reason. It was nutritionally rich, stored well, grew in poor soil, and could be cooked in coals with minimal equipment in the limited time available for cooking after a full day of forced labor. Fishing and hunting provided additional protein when geography and the specific rules of a particular plantation allowed. Enslaved men and boys who were permitted, or who managed without permission, to fish in nearby rivers and streams brought home catfish, perch, and other freshwater fish that were cooked and shared. Hunting was more restricted and more dangerous to pursue without explicit permission, but small game, rabbits, squirrels, possums, was caught through trapping methods that did not require firearms and that left less visible evidence of activity. The food obtained through these supplementary means was not charity or accident. It was the result of sustained, skillful effort by people navigating an oppressive system with every resource of knowledge and determination they possessed. The cuisine that emerged from enslaved communities in the antebellum South, what we now recognize as the foundation of Southern American food culture, was born in these conditions of scarcity and constraint and supplemented by the deep agricultural and culinary knowledge that enslaved Africans brought with them and maintained across generations. The technique of slow cooking tough, low-value cuts of meat until they became tender and flavorful. The use of pot liquor as a nutritional resource rather than a waste product. The specific seasoning traditions, the rice cultivation knowledge of the Gullah Geechee communities of the coastal southeast, the okra-based stews that became gumbo, all of this emerged from the creative and preservational efforts of people who were given the least and built the most with it. Historians still argue about the degree to which enslaved people were able to maintain meaningful food agency within the plantation system, whether the garden plots, the fishing, the hunting, and the cooking traditions represented genuine cultural continuity and resistance, or whether they were too constrained and too surveilled to constitute real autonomy. The honest answer is that it varied enormously by plantation, by enslaver, by region, and by individual circumstance, and that any single characterization fails the complexity of what was actually a vast range of lived experiences within the shared structure of an institution designed to deny humanity at every level. Children within this system experienced food as something bound up inextricably with the larger conditions of their lives, the uncertainty, the surveillance, the knowledge that what they had could be taken, that the ration could be reduced as punishment, that the garden plot could be forbidden, that the fish caught on a Sunday afternoon represented both nourishment and a small, necessary act of self-determination in a world designed to eliminate such acts wherever they appeared. The quirky detail feels inappropriate here, so instead here is something true. The culinary knowledge of enslaved communities survived, was passed down, fed generations, shaped the food identity of an entire nation, and is now, finally, gradually, being credited to the people who created it rather than absorbed silently into a broader American story that too long forgot to name its sources. You carry this knowledge forward with you through the rest of tonight's journey, because it belongs in the story, fully and without apology. There is a particular quality of anticipation that exists only in childhood, a physical sensation somewhere between excitement and anxiety that lives in the chest and makes ordinary time feel slower and significant time feel both faster and more vivid than usual. You know this feeling. Every child in every era has known this feeling. And in the 1800s American household, where the daily diet was defined by repetition and sufficiency rather than variety and abundance, this feeling was most reliably produced by the approach of a holiday, a feast day, a harvest celebration, a Christmas morning, a Thanksgiving table set with things that did not appear on any other day of the year. The contrast between ordinary eating and feast eating in the 1800s was so dramatic, so absolute, that it gave holiday food a weight of meaning and memory that is difficult to fully recreate in an era when abundance is the default and special occasion food is distinguished from everyday food by degree rather than by kind. Thanksgiving as a nationally observed holiday was not firmly established until 1863, when Abraham Lincoln proclaimed it a national day of thanks during the Civil War, but harvest celebrations and days of communal Thanksgiving existed throughout the century in various regional and religious forms, and the food associated with them followed recognizable patterns across different communities. The harvest table was the year's culmination, the physical proof that the labor of planting and tending and harvesting had produced enough, that the winter ahead had a foundation, that the family had made it through another growing season intact. Children experienced this table not just as a meal but as a kind of annual reckoning, a tangible answer to the question that agricultural life asked constantly and that children absorbed into their sense of security and anxiety: will there be enough? The foods on that harvest table were largely the same foods that appeared in daily eating, but in quantities and preparations that transformed them into something ceremonial. The roasted chicken or turkey that might appear occasionally through the year was now a whole bird, properly roasted rather than boiled, its skin crisp and brown, its smell filling the house in a way that made the morning of waiting feel endless. Root vegetables that were everyday staples were prepared with more care, mashed with butter and cream, seasoned more generously, arranged with an attention to presentation that daily cooking did not have time for. Pies appeared, and this is where the feast table diverged most dramatically from the daily diet, because pie, with its buttery crust and its sweetened filling and its status as a labor-intensive baked good that required real quantities of both fat and sweetener, was not everyday food for most families. It was special occasion food, and its appearance on the table signaled that today was different from all the days around it. Pumpkin pie is so thoroughly associated with American Thanksgiving that it has become almost a cliché, but its presence on the 1800s harvest table was genuinely earned rather than merely traditional. Pumpkins grew abundantly in American kitchen gardens, stored well through autumn, and could be cooked into a custard filling, spiced with cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, and sweetened with molasses or sugar, that used ingredients most households had available. It was not always what we would recognize as pumpkin pie today. Many 1800s versions were closer to what we might call a spiced custard, the pumpkin functioning as a vehicle for the warming spices and sweetness rather than as the dominant flavor. But it was pie, and it was sweet, and on a table that did not see sweetness often, it was extraordinary. Apple pie occupied an equally beloved position, and apples were among the most important fruit crops of 19th century America, grown in home orchards, pressed into cider, dried for winter storage, and baked into pies that appeared at harvest celebrations with the regularity of a tradition so established it no longer needed to be decided upon. Children who had spent August and September watching the apple trees in the orchard and tracking the progress of the fruit toward ripeness ate apple pie in October with the specific satisfaction of someone consuming something they had watched being made from its very beginning, through the planting and tending and harvesting and peeling and seasoning and baking that stood between the living apple on the tree and the warm slice on the plate. Christmas in the 1800s American household varied enormously by region, religion, and class in ways that make any single description inadequate. German immigrant communities brought with them elaborate Christmas food traditions, spiced cookies, stollen, specific Christmas breads, that were slowly adopted and adapted by their American neighbors. New England Puritan-descended communities had historically regarded Christmas with suspicion, a holdover from the Puritan rejection of Catholic feast days, and the holiday was not universally celebrated as a food occasion in the early part of the century. By the mid to late 1800s, the influence of Clement Clarke Moore's poem, of Charles Dickens's Christmas stories circulating in American editions, and of the German traditions imported by waves of immigrants had collectively transformed Christmas into something more recognizable to modern eyes, a holiday centered on family, gifts, and a table set with special foods. The quirky historical detail that tends to surprise people about 1800s Christmas eating is mincemeat pie, a dish that sounds medieval and essentially is a mixture of chopped meat, suet, dried fruits, spices, and sugar that was baked in a pastry crust and served as a sweet rather than a savory dish. The meat content of mincemeat gradually declined through the 19th century as the sweet and spiced fruit components became dominant, but many families in the early and mid-1800s were eating mincemeat pie that genuinely contained minced beef or venison alongside the raisins and currants and cinnamon. A combination that strikes modern palates as confusing but that made complete sense in a culinary tradition where the line between sweet and savory was drawn very differently than it is today. Historians still argue whether the idealization of the 1800s holiday table in later American cultural memory, the abundant, warm, family-centered feast of nostalgic imagination, accurately reflects the experience of most families or whether it reflects primarily the experience of prosperous white rural families whose abundance was exceptional rather than typical. You sit at the holiday table, and whatever is on it, it is more than yesterday, and more than tomorrow, and for right now that is everything. There is a question that tends to produce a specific reaction when it surfaces in conversations about 1800s American childhood, a kind of startled pause, a brief recalibration of assumptions, followed by the slow realization that everything you thought you knew about this topic was built on a foundation that did not account for one fairly significant variable. The question is, what did children drink? And the answer, delivered without dramatic build-up because it is dramatic enough on its own, is that children in 1800s America drank alcohol. Not occasionally, not as a rare medicinal exception, not in quantities so small as to be essentially symbolic, but regularly, routinely, as a normal and unremarkable part of daily life, in forms calibrated to their size and age but present nonetheless in the daily fluid intake of children across nearly every region, class, and community in the country. The logic behind this was not negligence or indifference to child welfare, though it is easy to read it that way from a modern perspective. The logic was water. Specifically, the problem of water, that in the 1800s, before municipal water treatment, before germ theory was established as medical consensus, before anyone fully understood the relationship between contaminated water supplies and the diseases that killed people in enormous numbers, water from wells and streams and rivers was genuinely, measurably dangerous. Typhoid fever, cholera, dysentery, these were waterborne diseases that swept through communities with terrifying regularity, and the deaths they caused were not abstract statistics but immediate, visible, neighborhood-level catastrophes that every family in an 1800s American town had either experienced directly or watched their neighbors experience. Water killed people. Everyone knew this, even if nobody could have explained the microbiology behind it. Fermented and distilled beverages, by contrast, were significantly safer because the fermentation or distillation process killed the pathogens that made water dangerous. This was not a scientifically articulated understanding in most households, it was practical knowledge, the accumulated observation of generations who noticed that people who drank ale and cider got sick less often than people who drank untreated water, and who drew the obvious practical conclusion without needing the theoretical framework to explain it. Beer and cider were safer than water. Therefore, beer and cider were what you drank. Children included. Small beer, a very low-alcohol fermented grain beverage, sometimes called table beer, with an alcohol content of roughly 1 to 3%, was brewed specifically for everyday household consumption, including by children. It was not the strong ale of the tavern. It was a mild, slightly sour, lightly fermented drink that was more nutritious than water, safer than water, and produced at home as a routine domestic activity the way that bread was baked or butter was churned. A child drinking small beer with their midday meal in the early 1800s was doing something that their parents considered not merely acceptable but actively sensible, a health-protective choice in a world where the alternatives were more dangerous. Hard cider was the great democratic beverage of the American countryside, produced from the apple orchards that virtually every farm maintained and drunk by everyone from grandparents to small children in quantities that would constitute a significant alcohol intake by modern standards. The alcohol content of hard cider varied depending on the sugar content of the apples and the length of fermentation, but a typical farmhouse cider might be 4 to 7% alcohol, comparable to a modern beer. Children drank it diluted, usually mixed with water in proportions that reduced the alcohol content while still providing the safety benefit of the fermented liquid. Historians still argue about how consistently this dilution practice was actually applied versus how much children simply drank cider at its full strength because it was what was available and nobody was measuring very carefully. Switchel was another common beverage for children working outdoors, particularly during hay harvest and other intensive summer agricultural labor. It was a mixture of water, vinegar, molasses or sugar, and ginger, non-alcoholic, refreshing in hot weather, and providing quick energy from the molasses sweetness alongside the slight acidity of the vinegar that farmers believed aided in cooling the body and preventing heat-related illness. Whether the specific health claims made for Switchel were accurate is debatable, but it was genuinely refreshing, genuinely energizing, and genuinely safer than plain water in communities where the water supply was unreliable. Children who worked alongside adults during harvest drank Switchel from communal jugs passed along the row of workers, and the ritual of the shared jug, the brief pause, the drink, the passing on, was one of those small social moments embedded in the physical memory of agricultural childhood. The temperance movement, which gathered significant momentum through the mid to late 1800s, was partly a response to the genuine problem of heavy alcohol consumption in American society. The tavern culture, the distilled spirits that were genuinely destructive, the whiskey that men drank in quantities that damaged families and communities. But the movement's rhetoric often swept up the mild fermented beverages of ordinary household life alongside the genuinely harmful hard drinking it was targeting, and one of the practical effects of temperance influence was a gradual shift toward alternatives, particularly toward the promotion of clean water as awareness of waterborne disease transmission grew, and toward beverages like root beer and ginger beer that provided flavor and some of the social function of fermented drinks without the alcohol content. The quirky footnote here is that the push for safe drinking water for children was substantially advanced by the same public health movement that was simultaneously advancing germ theory, and that the two developments, understanding that water could be made safe through treatment, and understanding why it had been unsafe in the first place, arrived together in the latter part of the century in a way that rather rapidly changed the calculus of what children should drink. By the 1880s and 1890s, the idea of giving children beer or cider as a matter of course was beginning to seem old-fashioned rather than sensible, a shift in perception that happened within a single generation. You drink your Switchel in the heat of the afternoon, the vinegar and molasses sharp on your tongue, and it is exactly what your body wanted even though you could not have explained why. You are not well. Not dramatically, not in the way that requires the kind of intervention that in the 1800s would mean a doctor arriving on horseback with a leather bag and a set of tools that you would prefer not to examine too closely, not that kind of sick. You are the ordinary kind of sick, the kind that visits every child with the reliable frequency of seasonal change, a cough that settled in your chest 3 days ago and has not yet decided to leave, a fever that comes and goes with the unpredictability of a houseguest who has not been given a clear departure date, a general heaviness in your body that makes the usual morning routine feel like it is being conducted underwater. Your mother has assessed you with the particular diagnostic efficiency of a woman who has evaluated illness in children many times before, using tools that have no names in medical literature because they are simply a mother's hands on a forehead, a mother's eyes reading the specific quality of a child's pallor, a mother's accumulated knowledge of what this particular child looks and sounds like when something is genuinely wrong versus when something will resolve itself by afternoon. The verdict is that you are staying inside today. And the treatment is beginning. Medicine in the 1800s American household existed in a space that modern eyes find difficult to categorize cleanly. It was simultaneously practical and superstitious, empirically grounded in some of its observations and wildly, sometimes dangerously wrong in others, drawing on indigenous plant knowledge, European herbal traditions, African healing practices, and a layer of folk belief that varied by region and community in ways that resisted any tidy summary. The food given to sick children was part of this larger medical landscape, and it carried with it the full complexity of that landscape, some of it genuinely effective, some of it nutritionally sound if medically dubious, and some of it reflecting the specific anxieties and theoretical frameworks of an era that was doing its best with what it had. Chicken broth, or more accurately, the long-simmered liquid produced by boiling an old hen with whatever vegetables were available, was the universal sick child food of the 1800s, and its reputation was entirely deserved. A broth cooked for several hours from bones and cartilage and meat released gelatin, minerals, and amino acids into the liquid in quantities that made it genuinely nourishing for a child whose appetite was suppressed by illness and whose digestive system needed something easy to process. The specific amino acid glycine, released from collagen during long cooking, has mild anti-inflammatory properties that modern nutritional science has begun to document. The women of the 1800s who pressed cups of warm broth on sick children were not working from biochemical knowledge. They were working from generations of observed outcomes, from the practical wisdom that sick children who drank broth recovered, and that broth was therefore what sick children received. Toast appeared on the sick child menu with equal reliability, and its logic was similar, easily digestible, gentle on a stomach that was not performing at full capacity, providing some caloric input without demanding much from the digestive system in return. Dry toast, or toast softened in warm broth, or toast with a very thin scraping of butter if the child could tolerate fat. This was the sickday food landscape, and its blandness was the point rather than an apology. The 1800s understanding of illness management included the intuition that a struggling body should not be asked to work hard at digestion, and the sick diet reflected this understanding in its consistent preference for soft, simple, easily processed foods. Sulfur and molasses was the spring tonic of choice in many American households, and if you were a child in the 1800s, you have an opinion about it. A strong opinion. A whole-body opinion that manifests as a specific facial expression the moment someone mentions it. The preparation was exactly what it sounds like, powdered sulfur stirred into molasses to make a thick, dark, deeply unpleasant paste that was administered to children every spring on the theory that winter's preserved food diet had thickened the blood and that the sulfur would thin it and purify the system for the active season ahead. The scientific basis for this treatment was essentially non-existent, but its practice was so widespread and so persistent that it constituted something close to a medical consensus at the folk level, a shared belief so thoroughly distributed across American households that questioning it would have seemed eccentric. Mustard plasters, a paste of ground mustard seed spread on cloth and applied to the chest of a child with a respiratory illness, were a treatment that actually had some physiological basis. The mustard produced a warming, counterirritant effect on the skin that increased local circulation and reportedly provided symptomatic relief from the congestion and muscle ache of chest colds. Children submitted to mustard plasters with varying degrees of cooperation, since the warming sensation was initially comforting and then progressively more intense and occasionally crossed the line into genuine burning if the plaster was left on too long or applied too thickly. The management of a mustard plaster, knowing when to remove it, how thick to apply it, how to prepare the child's skin, was a domestic medical skill passed between women of the era with the same seriousness as bread-making technique. Onion syrup, raw onion slices layered with sugar or honey in a jar and left to macerate until the onion released its juice into a thick, sweet savory liquid, was given for coughs with a conviction that bordered on reverence in many households. Historians still argue about whether onion syrup's persistent reputation across so many different cultures and centuries represents genuine efficacy or simply the remarkable persistence of folk remedies that taste medicinal enough to feel like they are working. What is clear is that onions contain quercetin and other compounds with genuine anti-inflammatory properties, and that the honey or sugar component provided soothing demulcent effects on an irritated throat, so the remedy was not entirely without foundation, even if its mechanism was understood in entirely different terms by the people administering it. The quirky detail that tends to surface in 1800s folk medicine research is asafoetida, a pungent, sulfurous spice derived from a Central Asian plant resin, with a smell so aggressively unpleasant that its common nickname was devil's dung, which was worn in small bags around children's necks as a protective amulet against illness, particularly in communities with Central European immigrant heritage. The theory was that the smell repelled both disease and the spirits that caused it. The actual mechanism, if any, may have been that the smell repelled other people, thereby reducing the sick child's exposure to additional pathogens through social distancing achieved by olfactory deterrence. Your mother brings you the broth, and you drink it, and it is warm all the way down, and the day outside the window continues without you, and for now that is completely fine. The light is different now. You have noticed this all your life, the way evening light in the hours before supper falls at a particular angle through whatever window your kitchen has, catching dust motes and the steam from the pot and the flour still suspended in the air from this morning's bread making, turning all of it briefly golden before the sun drops below the treeline and the room goes back to the dimmer, warmer light of the fire. This light means the day is almost done. It means the last of the outdoor work is wrapping up, the animals have been fed and watered and secured, the tools have been put away, and the family is beginning to move back toward the center of the house, back toward the hearth, back toward each other in the particular gravitational way that evening always pulls people in from their separate labors and gathers them, briefly, into the same warm room. Supper in the 1800s American household was the quietest meal of the day, and this is partly circumstantial. By supper time, everyone was tired, genuinely tired in the physical, bone-deep way that a full day of agricultural or domestic labor produces, not the vague, screen-induced fatigue of modern evenings but the specific exhaustion of a body that has been used hard since before sunrise and is now presenting its accounting, and partly a matter of tradition and resource. The largest, most substantial meal of the day was dinner, served at midday in most American households of the era, when workers needed fuel to carry them through the afternoon. Supper was lighter, simpler, often composed of whatever remained from dinner plus whatever could be quickly prepared with minimal effort from a cook who had already been working since dawn. What appeared on the supper table varied by season and circumstance, but certain patterns repeated with the comfortable predictability of things that work. Bread and butter, almost always, the bread from today's baking or yesterday's, the butter from the dairy, and this combination required essentially no preparation and provided genuine sustenance. Cold leftover meat from the midday dinner, sliced and eaten without reheating. A bowl of whatever vegetables had been cooked in quantity and could be served again cold or briefly warmed. Mush, again, always mush again, the eternal presence in the 1800s child's eating life, appearing at supper as reliably as it appeared at breakfast, perhaps slightly different in texture as it had cooled and thickened through the day, perhaps fried if there was fat to fry it in, but present, always present, the starchy constant around which everything else was arranged. Milk appeared at supper in households that had it, poured into mugs and drunk warm or cool depending on the season, and the specific comfort of warm milk at the end of a day was understood by children of the era in a way that needed no articulation. It was warming. It was filling in a gentle, undemanding way. It signaled the approaching end of the eating day and the approaching permission to rest, and these associations accumulated over childhood until warm milk and the end of the day became so thoroughly linked in the sensory memory that one reliably invoked the other. The children who ate this supper, who tore their bread and drank their milk and ate their cold leftover pork and their mush without complaint or ceremony, grew up in conditions that modern childhood development experts would find alarming in some respects and instructive in others. They were calorie sufficient on good years and calorie deficient on bad ones. They were protein adequate in households that had reliable access to meat and dairy, and protein poor in households that did not. They had virtually no exposure to the processed sugars and refined carbohydrates that drive so many modern childhood health concerns, and they had abundant physical activity built into every single day of their lives, not as a health intervention but as an unavoidable feature of the work that kept their families alive. Historians still argue about whether the nutritional profile of the average 1800s American child's diet was better or worse than what modern children eat, and the honest answer is that it was neither. It was different, in ways that reflect completely different relationships between human bodies and the food systems that surrounded them. The 1800s child's body was adapted to scarcity, to seasonal variation, to the specific nutritional profile of whole unprocessed foods eaten in direct relationship with the land that produced them. It was also subject to deficiencies and diseases and early deaths from causes that are entirely preventable today, and the nostalgia that sometimes attaches to historical eating should never be allowed to obscure this reality. What is true, and what stays with you as tonight's journey comes to its quiet close, is that food in the 1800s American childhood was never merely food. It was labor, the labor of growing it, harvesting it, preserving it, preparing it. It was relationship, the hierarchy of the table, the warmth of the shared bowl, the specific love expressed in a grandmother's hidden jar of apple butter. It was knowledge, the sourdough starter carried across a continent, the nixtamalization process that kept children healthier than anyone could explain, the preservation methods that stood between a family and hunger every winter. It was culture, the German Christmas cookies, the Gullah rice traditions, the Southern pot liquor that carried nutrition from the cooking liquid into the bodies of children whose rations were deliberately insufficient. The quirky final detail worth carrying with you into sleep tonight is this: apple seeds. Children in the 1800s played a counting game with apple seeds, pulling them from the core and pressing them to their foreheads or flicking them to predict the name of a future sweetheart, a practice so widespread it was documented across multiple regions and decades as simply a thing that children did with the apple cores that came from the same orchards that made their cider and their pies and their dried fruit stores. Even in the arithmetic of survival eating, there was play. Even in the most utilitarian relationship with food, there was wonder. Even hungry children, even tired children, even children who ate the same mush for the 10,000th morning in a row, they found the small magic in the apple core, and they played the game, and they laughed at whatever name the seed landed on. That is who they were. That is what they ate. And now, slowly, it is time to let them rest. Word count, 1003. The fire is burning low now, and the house is settling into its nighttime quiet, that particular creak and shift of old wood cooling that you have heard so many times it has become indistinguishable from silence. The children are finished with their supper, the bread, the milk, the cold leftover mush that nobody was particularly enthusiastic about but everyone ate because the body does not ask for enthusiasm, only for fuel. The youngest ones are already drowsy, heads heavy, the long day pulling them down toward sleep with the gentle irresistibility of something much larger than wakefulness. The older ones are quieter too, the usual end-of-day conversation slowed to murmurs, to the occasional soft word, to the sound of breathing that is already finding its nighttime rhythm. And you, who have traveled through this whole long century tonight, who have stood in the cold barn at dawn and tasted the mush and waited at the edge of the table and eaten the salted pork and the pickled beans and the holiday pie and the switchel in the heat of the afternoon and the broth when you were sick and the penny candy that lasted a whole week in careful rationing, you are allowed to put it all down now. All of it. The hunger and the labor and the cold floors and the endless mush and the smoky cellar and the crowded tenement kitchen and the plantation ration and the holiday table and the apple seed game. Let it settle. Let it become the soft, historical, gentle thing it is now, a life fully lived, fully fed in every sense that mattered, in a world so different from yours and yet composed of the same essential hunger for warmth, for sweetness, for enough, for one more warm piece of bread before the light goes out. The fire breathes. The house is still. The century is quiet. Sleep well.